I knew it. I knew it was coming. I knew it was coming. I didn't want it to come, but I knew it was coming. That's why I was trying to hurry up and get started. But that's some of the retarded ones he was talking about. And so there are many reasons why I'm glad to be in Wichita. First place is I like Wichita. I've been here many times, and I like it. It's one of my favorite cities. And then, of course, I'm glad to be with my favorite preacher, Dr. John Rice, whom I believe is perhaps the most sincere and genuine Christian I've ever met. And then to be with my second favorite family, the Rice family. My family is my favorite family. And to be with them, what a wonderful blessing to see them and to be a part of this conference, and to be with Dr. Hudson, my good friend, and to hear Dr. Henderson. By the way, all your 20-minute sermons today are over. It's either preach 20 minutes, it's either preach longer than 20 minutes or study, and I've chosen to preach longer. And so I thank you so much for the joy of being here. Thank you for coming this morning. This is a wonderful morning crowd, and I'm delighted to be with you. Open your Bibles, please, to the book of Joshua. The book of Joshua. That's Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Acts, and then Joshua. Chapter 1 and verse 7. Joshua chapter 1 and verse 7. It's rather difficult this morning for me to know exactly which direction to go. We have so many preachers here, and then we also have so many students. I'm glad to see the students back there. And then beside the preachers and students, we have some human beings also. And so it's a little hard to know. I want to preach to the preachers, and I'd like to preach to the students, and I'd like to preach to the lay people. And so I'm going to go this route this morning. In Joshua chapter 1, verse 7, only be thou strong and very courageous, that thou mayest observe to do according to all the law which Moses my servant commanded thee. Turn not from it to the right hand or the left, that thou mayest prosper whithersoever thou goest. This book of the law shall not depart out of thy mouth, but thou shalt meditate therein day and night, that thou mayest observe to do according to all that is written therein. For then thou shalt make thy way prosperous, and then thou shalt have good success. Now, without your turning to it, I'm going to add one verse to that, and this is the text verse, and I'll just read it for you in the 12th Psalm, verse 1. Help, Lord, for the godly man ceaseth, for the faithful fail among the children of men. The faithful fail among the children of men. I want to speak this morning on the subject, on a subject that is appropriate to everyone here. Now, I have 18 Bibles like this, and I have my outlines. I happen to have 55 sermon outlines in this Bible. I have a table of contents back here. That's where I can find it. And then the sermons are throughout the Bible like that, outlined. And I have 18 Bibles. This one has 55 sermons in it. These are Bibles I use in conferences like these. Some of those sermons I have written beside it here. Youth. Here's one that says youth. Here's one that says preachers. Here's one that says Bible study. Here's one that says youth workers. Here's one that says motivation. And I have different sermons that apply to different people. But the message I'm going to bring this morning will apply to every single person in this room. Now, we've come from all different backgrounds. We have all different kinds of houses and jobs and social standings and financial conditions. But there's one common denominator that unites all of us in one crowd today, and that is every one of us has tasted the pain of failing. I've failed, and you failed. I want to speak this morning on this subject. You can fail and not be a failure. You can fail and not be a failure. I'm talking this morning to some lady who wishes that she had heard what you're going to hear this afternoon many years ago. I'm talking to some lady who's failed as a wife. You dreamed of being a wife, but somehow you didn't get the training that you wish that you needed to get. And the years have come and the years have gone. You sit here this morning having failed as a wife. It's too late for you. Your husband's gone, maybe to eternity, maybe divorce has come into your home, and you wish you had a chance this morning to succeed. But the truth is, you failed. I'm talking to someone this morning who dreamed of pastoring, went to Bible college and graduated, and all during school you dreamed of the day when you could have your own church. And you had all kinds of plans and hopes and dreams, but you sat here this morning and you failed. You didn't mean to fail. You don't really know why you failed, but you failed. I'm talking this morning to some parents who dreamed of having children, and God sent children into your home, and you intended to have a wonderful, close relationship with them. The years came, and the years went far too rapidly. And you sat here this morning having failed. A boy is on dope. A girl is with a hippie communal somewhere. A teenager has rebelled. A daughter is pregnant. A son is on liquor. And this morning you sat here with a broken heart, and you honestly would have to say, as a mom or as a dad, I failed. I'm talking to someone who's failed as a child, failed as a teenager. I'm talking to someone who's failed in the Sunday school class. I'm talking to someone who's failed on a bus route. Now listen to me. There is one thing that all of us have in common, and that one thing is we fail. Now, this could be, I'm not going to preach a great message, and God knows I'm not a great preacher, but I have a great truth this morning, and one that is worthy of your intense fellowship as I speak to you on a subject that applies to every single one of us. You can fail and not be a failure. Our Heavenly Father, if I recounted today all the times I failed in preaching, my time would be gone before I began. All the times I failed as a pastor, all the times I failed as a Christian, I pray this morning that you'd help us failures. All of us are failing. We fail. As we sit together and admit our failures, I pray this morning that from those failures will come success. Holy Spirit, speak to my heart and speak through me to the hearts of those who hear. And with that young teenage boy way back in the back, listen as intently as the note-taking preacher on the front. Now center our attention for these moments on one thought, and may our lives be changed therefrom. Amen. I do not know how long ago it was. I'm guessing a year. I was preaching one Sunday morning. The mayor of our city happened to be sitting on the front row. He was not there for any cause except he's a Catholic, but he comes by to visit. He has a grandson who has leukemia, and the mayor seems to gain strength from just dropping the service occasionally at First Baptist Church. The police chief was sitting beside him. About two-thirds along in the sermon, something happened to me up here. I know, something always happens to me up here. I called home this morning and said to my secretary, she said, you've had a little sinus trouble, haven't you? I said, yes. I said, a bunch of green stuff is draining from my head. She said, it's gray stuff that's been draining from your head. And, the gray stuff had drained from my head that particular morning. And that morning, about two-thirds of my sermon, I was weary. I had not slept over 3 hours a night for that week. And suddenly I lost what I thought was coherence in my message. I was very embarrassed. I'm sure that numbers of you have faced this thing. You got mentally tired. And I just didn't really know what I was saying during the remainder of the sermon. I tried to finish, and I did finish, and gave the invitation quite by habit and wrote. Invitation was finished. I had the folks to sit down, and I read the names. Now, our altar is almost 220 feet wide, and our building is 220 feet wide, and the altar is it's as wide as this whole building here or wider. And so the secretaries always put an E if somebody who got converted is sitting on the east side. That was over here in our place. And a W if they're sitting on the west side. Well, that morning, Brother Smith, I could not discern which was the east and which was the west. I honestly was so mentally exhausted, I just did not really understand all that was going on. It never happened before, and it never has not happened again. has not happened again, has not happened again, has not happened again. And until now. But it does me good occasionally to find out how that you have to live all the time. And so I read the names and wondered if I had made sense. Service was over. I ran to my study. I fell on my face and asked God to help me. And then that afternoon, I got a little rest. And that night, I was back to normal. Several, which is not very far from where I was that morning. But several months passed. I was preaching in Atlanta, Georgia. At that time, our oldest daughter, Becky, was living in Atlanta. And she and her husband asked if they could take me out for a bite to eat. After the service, we went out to eat. And Becky said, "Dad, I heard you preach on tape today, or recently, the greatest sermon I ever heard you preach." And I said, "Puddin', thank you." She said, "Dad, I've heard you preach thousands of times, but the greatest sermon I've ever heard on tape by anybody, I heard you preach and just played it recently." I said, "Well, thank you." She said, "Dad, R.G. Lee, he didn't know how to preach compared to that." She said, "That honestly was the best sermon I've ever heard." I said, "Hey, I've got to find out what that sermon is. I want to preach it again." And I said, "What's the title of it?" And she said, "Dad, the title was, There is a way that seemeth right unto a man." I said, "Puddin', that was the sermon." "What sermon, Dad?" I said, "Puddin', that's the one." She said, "What one?" And I said, "Puddin', that's the one I blacked out in and didn't know what I was saying." And she said, "Dad, God never used you like He used you in that sermon." And I learned what I already knew. Our weakness is what God can use. And our strength is made perfect in weakness. And God can use failures like you and like me. All of us have failed. I was up in New York City not long ago preaching, and I picked up the newspaper on a Monday, and the funniest thing I ever read in the newspaper, I guess, I read. This gal had tried to kill herself. She had jumped off the 87th floor of the Empire State Building, trying to commit suicide, and the Augusta wind took her and blew her back to the building, and she landed on a ridge on the 86th floor. And a 2.5-foot ridge. If she'd have aimed at it, she wouldn't have hit it. But she jumped off and came back, and she went to the hospital, and they interviewed her. It was a newspaper. And they said, "Why did you try to kill yourself?" And she said, "Because I've been a failure at everything I've ever tried to do." And I thought, boy, she really has. I guess a person fails at suicide, he's been a failure. You know, the honest truth is, we're all a bunch of flops. That's all we are, is a bunch of flops. And all a bunch of human beings full of weakness. Now, two statements that seem to contradict each other. First is this: everybody has to fail. Everybody has to fail. And then this: nobody has to be a failure. I said everybody has to fail. I said nobody has to be a failure. Now listen carefully, because the next two lines are the basic foundation of my message. One is this: failing is the ingredient from which failure is made. I said failing is the ingredient from which failure is made. Secondly, failing is the ingredient from which success is made. Now, everybody fails. You can take your failings and use those failings as ingredients for failure. Or if you so choose, you can take those failings and use those failings as ingredients for success. You can decide. Now, I'm going to make about 6 statements, and I want you to listen very carefully, because each is built on the previous one or one. One, back yonder one time, God had something He wanted done. Now listen, God had something He wanted done. Number 2, God made you to do that something. Did you hear me? I said there was something God wanted done. And God made you. Young man, there's a reason why you're on this earth. Back yonder, God said, I need a job done. And God said, I've got to make a man for that job. and God made you for that job. There's something that you can do God did not call me to do. There's something you can do God did not call John Rice to do. There's something you can do God did not call Curtis Hudson to do. There is a unique purpose. You're no uh-oh. You're no, God didn't look down and say, I wonder who he is. God didn't say, I'll declare, I'll swan, or uh-oh. God made you on purpose. And that same thing is true about every person in this room. God had a job He wanted somebody to perform, and God made you to perform that job. Number 3, that means that God had a need for somebody just like you. I don't know why, but He has a need, especially you. Why? But God has a need. If God had a job that He wanted done, and if God made you to do that job, then God needed somebody just like you. When God made me, He didn't need another John Rice. When God made me, He didn't need another Curtis Hudson. He hadn't made you yet, I guess. But when God made me, He didn't need another Billy Sunday. God needed somebody to pastor the First Baptist Church of Hammond, Indiana. God needed somebody uniquely equipped. And God made, hey, you are a designer's model. You are an original. There's nobody like you, and there never will be anybody like you. God had a job to perform. He made you custom-made for that job, and that means that God needed somebody just like you. That makes me feel important. I mean, that makes me feel like somebody. That God needed somebody like me. Number 4, God had something to be done. God made you to do it. That means you're something that God had a need for somebody like you, and that means that you are somebody, and that means this. God made you to be a success. Now follow the logic. If there was a job to do, and if God made you do that job, then God needed somebody like you, and then you are somebody. That means God made you to be a success. I'm so sick and tired of this failure complex in America, I don't know what to do. I'm so tired of us losing in boxing matches to Cuba. Every time I read the newspaper and find out we lost to Cuba, I want to come out of retirement myself and try again. I mean, I'm sick of it. God didn't say you're more than flock through Him that loved us. God said we're more than conquerors through Him that loved us. Blessed is the man that walketh not in the counsel of the ungodly, nor standeth in the way of sinners, nor sitteth in the seat of the scornful. But his delight is in the law of the Lord, and in His law doth he meditate day and night. He shall be like a tree planted with a river of water that bringeth forth his fruit in his season. His leaf also shall not wither, and whatsoever he doeth shall prosper. God made you to be a success. Why? He made you for a job. He had a job to do. He made you to do it. Ethel Waters said, God don't sponsor no flops. So God made you to be a success. Romans 8:37, we're more than conquerors. Philippians chapter 4, verse 13, I can do all things through Christ. There's nothing too hard for the Lord. Is anything too hard for God? All things are possible to him that believeth. God made you to be a success. I was sitting in Staten Island, New York, in the lobby of a Holiday Inn. I picked up a little paper. It wasn't Norman Vincent Peale's paper, but something almost that pathetic. I picked it up and began to read it. And I read a story. I loved it. I loved it. I loved it. I loved it. A little boy, it is said, had a bat and a ball. And he decided to throw the ball up in the air and hit it with the bat. You've done it. I've done it in the plains of Texas again and again with a stick and some rocks or a bat and a ball. And the kid got the bat, put it on his shoulder. He held the ball like that, tossed the ball up in the air, took a swing, missed the ball completely. Oh, he was angry. I'll get it next time, he said. He got the ball, and he tossed the ball up in the air and watched it carefully as it fell, and he took another swing and hit it in the same place he hit it the first time. He missed again. Now he strikes it. He says, I've got to do it. And he takes that ball, watches it carefully, tosses it carefully up in the air, watches its descent, and as it gets right to the right spot, takes a swing and misses the third time. And then he throws the bat down and says, boy, what a picture! I love it, I love it, I love it, I love it, I love it. He wasn't going to be a failure. Oh, let me tell you, God didn't make you to flop. Let me say again. Follow me carefully. Every step. God had a job he needed done. God made you to do that job. God needed somebody just like you. You are somebody. Then God made you to be a success. Now, number 6. In the making of you to be a success, God uses, among other things, failure. Hold it, preacher. You said God uses failure to make a success? Yes, that's right. You said, I'm on my way to success then. Yeah, if God uses failure. He does. I said there was a job. God made you. He needed you. You're somebody. He made you succeed. But in leading you to success, God uses failure. Let me illustrate. I was in my hometown of Dallas, Texas, recently preaching. I stayed just a few blocks from where I grew up. The pastor gave me a car, and I drove around on Tuesday afternoon to the old spots where I used to live. I went to the 1600 block on Ann Arbor Street in Dallas, Texas, out in it used to be a ghetto area. And the 1600 block of Ann Arbor is a hill. The entire block is a hill. There's a creek at the bottom of that hill. And I parked the car. And remember, I learned to ride a bicycle on that hill. My dad had found a bicycle torn to pieces in a garbage can, had taken the pieces out of the garbage can, put it back together, made me a bicycle. I was 6 years old. I got up the top of that hill. It looked easy. I had never ridden a bicycle before, but I'd seen other folks do it. It looked easy. I got on the bicycle, and it took off in all directions, and I ended up in the creek. I failed. I get up and I said, I know what I did. I know exactly what I did wrong. Took the bicycle back to the top of the hill and got on it and overcorrected, and ended up on the other side of the bridge in the same creek. I spent most of that day falling down. Here's the summary of that day. I failed, and 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 I succeeded. You say, preacher, I've been a flop. Okay. God is using that. And God can use that to see to it that you'll be a success. Somebody said a big shot is a little shot that just don't quit shooting. Just keep on shooting. Just keep on shooting. God uses success. I have to know something about you when you learn to sing. For a long time, nobody wanted to hear you. Back yonder when you were a boy, taking voice lessons, your dad wished that singing had never been invented. And you Rice girls, I got a few things about you, too. When you first learned to play Bach, Bach turned over in his grave. Mozart considered pressing charges. And Beethoven wished he had never taken up music. You see, I know how he became such a accomplished musician. I've got some of those that grew up in my house, too. I have sat through recital after recital after recital. And there will be in heaven a special reward. I'd rather go through half the tribulation period than sit in those recitals. Somebody said the other day about our oldest daughter, Becky, said, is she a natural musician? I said, in my living room all those years, you wouldn't think she's a natural musician? Oh, my soul! She failed, and 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 she succeeded. Here's the recipe for success. Failure plus failure plus failure plus failure plus failure plus failure equals success. And that's the recipe. That's the formula. But you say, preacher, I pastored this church for 2 years, and we can't get off the ground. Then keep on. Do you know what the main difference is in the men on this program this morning and some this week and some who are not? The men on the program who sign your Bibles are no better preachers than you are, and no more sincere than you are. They just stayed when they faced the same obstacle that made you quit. They failed, and they failed, and they failed, and they failed, and they succeeded. But here's what you did. You failed, and you failed, and you quit. Hey, I asked the students in Hyles Anderson College to give me their favorite preachers. I said, give me the 10 greatest preachers in America. Every one of them who were pastors had been to their churches over 18 years. I said, give me one of the fast-growing churches in America. Fastest growing. Somebody said, Dr. Bob Gray. Okay. What does he run in Sunday school, they said. I said, it's 3,000. How long has he been there? 25 years. What were they running when he came? 500. How much growth is that? 2,500. How many years? 25 years. How many is that a year? 100. How many is that a Sunday? Less than 2. Setting the woods on fire, isn't he? And that's mushroom growth. That's the giant. That's Dr. Bob Gray. 2 a Sunday. Let me tell you something. The only difference in the successful preachers and those who are not, the successful preachers more times and kept on failing till succeeding. Few observations. One is, failing is not a failure unless you make it the last chapter. Edmund Cook said, what is failure? It is only a spur to the one who received it right. It makes the spirit within him stir to go in once more and fight. If you've never failed, it's an easy guess. You've never won any high success. Look, I preach 1,000 times a year. And I'm sure of those 1,000 times a year, 100 of those aren't much. And I imagine 25 of those are really flops. I've gone to my room, as you have, Dr. Hudson, and I've said I just didn't have it tonight. I wonder if anybody's going to come back tomorrow night. I know I'm not. But I just wonder, will anybody show up tomorrow night? And I've known I failed, and I've tasted the bitter pain, but I never say, I'm going to quit. I always say, boy, I'll get them tomorrow night. Get up! Wife, so you failed. You get here this afternoon. Hear these ladies tell you how to be a good wife, and you go home and succeed. Amen. Okay, mother, so you failed. You come this afternoon and learn how these ladies have become good mothers, and you come back and succeed. Hey, we're not a bunch of perfect people in a church as a museum piece to be shown off and exhibited. We're all a bunch of flops trying to learn how to do better. Church is not a spiritual museum where perfect relics are exhibited. Church is a spiritual hospital where sinners come to get well. And if God ever does anything in the world, He's got to do it through folks who fail, who won't stop with failing. Secondly, second observation, failing is only a temporary setback. Hey, you know who I like? I like the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. 26 times in a row they lost. But anybody that knew John McKay, their coach, knew they wouldn't fail. They invented new ways to fail and to lose. Now, I'll give you in one sentence the history of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. They lost, and 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 they won their division this year. Why? Because they're not like you. I just feel like it's time to go to a new field. Yeah. Go out in the cotton field and pray all night. I also like the Dallas Cowboys. Glory to God. Stay out of my preaching. Tom Landry, I heard Tom Landry say this. When they lost, they went 2 years, didn't win a thing. Tom Landry said they were so bad, when the team came out of the huddle, you could always tell which one of the three running backs was going to carry the ball. The other two were smiling. Tom Landry said that when the quarterback, he was the only team he'd ever seen, when the quarterback took the ball and pitched it out to the running back called for a fair catch. But anybody that knew Tom Landry knew he wasn't going to be a failure. He failed, and 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 he failed. And then he's built perhaps the most coveted franchise in the entire National Football League. Why? Because he didn't quit when you did. When I was down for a week in Springfield, when Dr. Noel Smith was living, he asked me on Monday if he could take me out to eat on Friday at noon. He didn't speak to me all week. He wasn't rude. He just didn't cross my path all week. He took me out to that little, it was on the corner of Glenstone and Kearney there, little rock place where all of us have stayed. We sat there. He didn't talk while we ate. He didn't talk. We just ate. He did say he wanted to take me out to eat, so that's what we did. If you knew Dr. Smith, he was a very dear fellow, but abrupt. And we sat there and sat there and sat there, and finally, just before we left, he said, Dr. Hyles, I took you out to eat because I want to say a word to you. You've just gone to Hammond. I've just been there a few months and was discouraged. He said, this is the word. He stood up, stood at the edge of the booth, and took his fist, hit the booth like that, and said, stay! Paid the bill and left. He did me a favor I'll always appreciate. Stay! The third observation is this. Failing is not a disgrace unless you make it the last chapter. I failed in my first sermon. I failed in my first church. Didn't baptize one convert in my first pastorate. Didn't have one by membership. Not one baptism. Not one. Not one rededication. Not one. John Mark failed in the first missionary journey. But he wasn't a failure. He came back and wrote the second book in the New Testament. Peter failed when he denied the Lord and cursed and swore and said, I don't belong to that crowd. But he wasn't a failure. He came back in a few days and preached the great sermon on Pentecost. Jacob failed when he cheated his brother twice. But he wasn't a failure. He came back and became a prince with God at Jabbok. Jonah failed. He left the will of God, took off for Joppa, was cast off the ship, swallowed of the whale. He failed, but he wasn't a failure. He came back and preached the great sermon of the great revival in Nineveh. Abraham failed, but he wasn't a failure. He was told to leave his homeland and leave his kindred. He didn't. He took Lot. Leave your household, father's household. He didn't. Took his dad. Was told to go to Canaan. He didn't. Stopped at Haran. He failed. Lied about Sarah being his wife, but he wasn't a failure. He became a friend of God. Abraham Lincoln failed in storekeeping, failed in surveying, failed in soldering, failed in the law practice, failed in business. Took 17 years to pay off his bankruptcy debts. He failed in becoming an Illinois legislator. He failed in his attempt to become a United States congressman. He failed in 1856 in his attempt for the vice presidency, but he wasn't a failure. Abraham Lincoln's recipe was failing, plus failing, plus failing, plus failing, plus failing, plus failing, plus failing, equal one of the great presidents of our nation's history. Paul failed when he wanted to go back to Jerusalem, and I think left the will of God, had his head shorn when he shouldn't have done it, but he wasn't a failure. Moses failed when he lost his temper and smote the rock twice, and when he killed a man back yonder years ago, but he wasn't a failure. David failed in his activity with Bathsheba and yes, the murder of Uriah, but he wasn't a failure. Let me tell you something. You don't have to be a failure. But you say, Brother Hyles, I don't say it. Get up and succeed. And if you fail, get up and try. If you fail, get up and try. If you fail, get up and try. talking to wives who fail, talking to husbands who fail. I'm talking to moms who fail. I'm talking to dads who fail. I'm talking to Sunday school teachers who fail. I'm talking to bus workers who fail. I'm talking to pastors who fail. I'm talking to deacons who fail. You don't have to end it there. Next observation. Keep your eye on the goal. When you stumble, get up and look back at the goal and start marching towards it again. J.C. Penney said, give me a stock clerk with a goal, and I'll give you a man who'll make history. Give me a man without a goal, and I'll give you a stock clerk. The fifth observation, and I want you to listen very carefully because this applies to most of us. If you have already been a failure, I didn't say if you failed, I mean if you've already been a failure, and there's no way to recapture the opportunity where you failed, get you a new goal and succeed in a new area. Follow me. So he divorced you. He shouldn't have. But if you had been the kind of loving, attentive wife you should have been, he would not have divorced you. And you sit here this morning and your heart breaks on the inside because you're lonely. And you'll say, preacher, I'll be honest with you. I've been a failure. But it's too late. He's dead or he's gone. I can't. Okay. If you cannot be a good wife and the chances are all gone for life, then you decide to become the best mother in this world. One of my Sunday school teachers came to me and said, Pastor, I'm resigning my class. I said, why? I called him Bob. I said, why, Bob? He said, because you know my son and my daughter both turned out bad. My son was expelled from school and my daughter got in trouble, and I'm resigning my Sunday school class. And I said, I don't understand that logic at all. Understand it. You failed as a father, so you're going to fail as a Sunday school teacher too. That doesn't make sense. I said, if I were you, I'd get on my knees and say, oh my God, I failed. I'm sorry I failed. I didn't mean to fail. Forgive me. And I'd say, God, I'll tell you one thing. I'm going to make you the best Sunday school teacher in this church. I'd take the mistakes I made in rearing my children, and I would correct those mistakes and help other young folks become what they ought to become. Even in a rotten apple, there's seed that can bring forth more apples. If you came to Hyles Anderson College, this man may be here. He travels for our college a lot. If you came to Hyles Anderson College as a guest, you'd be met at the airport by the best PR man of any college in America. I mean, we may not have the best president, we may not have the best faculty. I think we do. We may not have the best student body, but I'm granting other schools the right to exist, barely. But I won't even talk to you about PR man. We got the best PR man in the world. If you came to Hyles Anderson College as a guest, John Olson would meet you at the airport in a Cadillac car. I don't mean a new one. I want these long ones. Cadillac car. He would meet you with a handshake, with a letter, and probably your check. Before you ever got out of the airport, you'd have your love offering. He would shadow you all the time you were there, and you would feel like the President of the United States. John Olson is somebody. Who is this John Olson? I met John. He sold drugs to drugstores. But he wasn't making a living. John Olson couldn't sell a shot of penicillin to a man dying with double pneumonia. He flopped. So, John decided to buy a Milex corporation. He took all his savings, life savings, invested and lost it. Lost his house. I mean, had to give his house, pay off his debts. He was in his middle 50s. No house. He had the house completely paid for, lost it all. I called John to my study one day and I said, John, I want to make you assistant to the president of Hyles Anderson College. He said, me? Yeah. Why, he said, I couldn't even sell drugs. I said, we're not going to sell any drugs at Hyles Anderson College. He said, well, preacher, that Milex Corporation, I flopped. I said, we don't even plan to have a car repair shop at Hyles Anderson College. I said, John, I just want you to make everybody feel welcome who walks on our campus. And John Olson failed and he failed, and he failed, and he failed, and he failed, and he succeeded. He failed in one area. The door was closed. He failed in another area. The door was closed. But he has a new one. And you can get a new one. So the children are grown. So they broke your heart. So you cry yourself to sleep every night. Okay, I know you feel that. And you ought to. And I know you're heartbroken. And it's normal. But don't quit. Find some other area where you can do something and be a success. I want to tell you a story, and I want you to hinge on it now, because I don't want to tell it. Oh, 12, 13, 14 years ago, one of my deacons, one of the finest deacons we had, and his wife got too close to another couple in our church. Young couples, don't do it. Don't do it. My deacon, whose wife at one time had worked on my staff, she'd quit because she was expecting a baby, but years before, she'd worked on the staff. That thought he fell in love with the other guy's wife. And his wife thought she fell in love with the other guy. A scandal spread through our church because one of our finest deacons had traded wives with another guy. Now listen. Our hearts were broken. But I never quit praying. I prayed for that deacon every day for years. I imagine 10 years, 8 to 10 years passed, maybe less, but years passed. And one night, late at night, when I was just about to go home, about 11 o'clock after counseling for 5 or 6 hours, that deacon walked down the hallway. He had not been in our church in years. He walked down the hallway of my study. He said, "Preacher, can I talk to you?" And I said, "Well, of course you can." And he said, "Preacher, I've blown it. I've done wrong. I know I've done wrong. But I can't undo it. There's no way I can divorce a present wife, go back to my first. I can't undo it. I've done wrong." He said, "Preacher, is there anything in the world that God could let me do now?" And I'll call him George. I said, "George, you'll never be a deacon again. And the many other things you'll never be able to do for God. But I said, George, you still can be used of God. Dear Lord, take up the tangled strands that we have wrought in vain, that by the skill of thy dear hands some beauty may remain." If you came to First Baptist Church of Hammond next week, you wouldn't find George sitting, serving the Lord's Supper with the other deacons. Nor would you find George meeting with our deacons on Saturday night. But if you came to First Baptist Church of Hammond next Sunday morning, early in the morning, you'd find George getting a bus started. And you'd find him driving that bus down the street like a chauffeur would drive for a king. George drives. And he drives. And he drives. He failed. The door was locked. It was shut. He couldn't go back and succeed. Let me tell you something. If you failed and there's no way to go back in that area in which you failed, then get you another. In God's name, don't face God someday a total flop. Listen carefully. John Rice and I were in Danville, Illinois at a conference together. Pastor of the world's largest Sunday school and the editor of the foremost Christian weekly in the 20th century's mightiest pen. We advertised, and the two of us there, do you know how many we drew that first night? 80. He drew 70 and I drew 10. Next morning we grew from 80 to 40. We never had such a conference in our life. As soon as the conference ended, the pastor ran off with one of the ladies in the church. We went to the airport, shook our heads. Both of us said that's the worst we ever had. Several months and several years passed, and I got a letter from a fellow. A fellow told me, he said, "Dr. Hyles, my life was changed. I heard you and Dr. Rice preach one time." "Where?" "Danville, Illinois." "What?" "Yeah. He said, I was a dead preacher, didn't even give an invitation on a Sunday morning. My life was changed. What's his name? Dr. Bob Moore, Marietta, Georgia. Another fellow walked up to me later. He said, Dr. Hyles, I want to thank you. You and Dr. Rice changed my ministry. And I said, where? He said, Danville, Illinois. Heard you preach, 80 people. He said, I was a failure. But he said, that meeting, God did something and changed my life. His name? Dr. Wally Beebe. Mr. Buss. We preached in Atlanta, Georgia one time at one of the worst conferences ever known to man. We thought about changing the name of the Sword of the Lord Conference to the Norman Vincent Peale Conference. We left that conference, we thought, with a miserable failure. But in that conference, God changed the young preacher. He sits right here. Curtis Hudson. You don't know when you succeed. You don't know. I mean, just keep on shooting. Just keep on shooting. Just keep on shooting. But you say, I failed. Okay, get up. But you say, get up. But you, get up. Quit talking back to me. Napoleon was making his ruthless march, try to conquer the world. He had never tasted defeat. He came to a certain place in a certain battle where his forces were being defeated. Napoleon realized he'd lose all of his men unless he did something to pull back, regroup his forces. He went up to his little bugler boy and said, son, he said, we're being defeated. All of our men will be killed. We're going to lose the battle for sure unless we can pull back, regroup, make some new plans. He said, son, quickly, draw a retreat for our men. Little bugler boy looked up and said, sir, you never taught me a retreat. He said, son, we've got to retreat. Draw a retreat. Tears streamed down his cheeks, and he said, sir, I don't know any retreats. All I know to do is blow a charge. And then Napoleon said, son, I command you, blow a retreat. I can't blow a retreat. He said, I said, blow a retreat. Do the best you can. Little boy with tearful eyes held the trumpet to his hand, to his lips, and try though he may, all he could blow was a charge. When he blew that charge, Napoleon's forces said, good night. We must have some recruits coming up from the rear to join us. Some fresh blood. When that little boy blew that charge, the enemy forces said, wow, they must have some new men coming up. We better run. And they ran. And Napoleon's forces charged. And the victory came. Why? Because one little bugler boy never learned how to blow a retreat. It's no disgrace to fail. It's very common. I could pack this room with stories about my failings. But you don't have to be a failure. Because failing plus failing plus failing plus failing plus failing equals failure. Or failing plus failing plus failing plus failing plus failing equals success. It's all up to you. Failing is the ingredient from which failure is made. And failing is the ingredient from which success is made.